Hello, everyone. Good morning to some of you, good afternoon, and good day to every one of you who have joined this interesting talk or webinar organized by Institute of Chartered Shipbrokers Sri Lanka branch with the great help from ICS London, especially Mr. Matt, who helped us by connecting us with this celebrity speaker, Mr. Lars Jensen, all the way from Copenhagen, Denmark. So before I introduce briefly Mr. Lars to you all, let me thank a few people, that is Matt from ICS London, and also my ICS Sri Lanka organizing committee and the EXCO, and also our main sponsor for the event today, which is China SOC Lines. A very special thanks to China SOC Lines for sponsoring this important webinar by ICS Sri Lanka, and also our usual corporate sponsor, that is South Asia Gateway Terminal, SAGT, in Sri Lanka. Having thanked all of them, of course, Mr. Lars Jensen is a person who needs no introduction. Almost everyone knows him very well. He's one of the leading analysts and thought leaders in the arena of container shipping. Of course, most of you by now must have read his LinkedIn profile. And without taking much of his time reading out his profile, which is available for every one of you through our flyer and through our other communications, let me invite Mr. Lars Jensen to start his interesting talk about these uncertain times and on how we could face these upcoming new challenges. Mr. Lars Jensen, thank you so much for joining all the way from Copenhagen at this time. And we really appreciate your time and commitment given to us for personnel from all over the world, for them to learn about these trends and how to face such new challenges. Over to you, Mr. Lars. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me on to the webinar here. Let me jump straight into it and share a small presentation that I have prepared for this purpose. There we go. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to provide you with a perspective I have on what the current trends are in the container liner shipping industry. I will, of course, look at some of the more topical issues that is of importance right now, such as the Ukraine-Russia war, and also the issues related to the shutdowns that we have seen in China over just the last couple of days. But I'm not just going to look at what is immediately in front of us. I'm also going to take a perspective on how long is it going to take before the supply chains normalize? And once they do normalize, what will then happen in the rest of this decade? What does normal look like? Where will the industry be when we get to about 2030 at the end of this decade? There's, of course, a lot of different topics. I'm going to take them more or less one by one. But I think it's important to first put a few words on exactly where we are now and also how we got here, because there's a number of learning points there that are important when we need to understand what will happen in the rest of 22 and also into 23. At least my experience is, when I think back a year to the beginning of 2021, there was a sentiment of surely it cannot get any worse. Remember, in the beginning of 2021, we had, say, 40 ships lying in wait outside Los Angeles. We were beginning to see declines in schedule reliability. Freight rates had, in some trades, but not all, doubled compared to where we were before the pandemic. And it felt like there was new records being set every week. So in the beginning of 2021, the sentiment was very much, surely this cannot get any worse. Then 2021 happened, and it clearly proved that things could get a whole lot worse compared to where we were in the beginning of the year. And there's a number of elements that are important here. We had, of course, the Suez Canal blockage. That came on top of a supply chain that was already heavily pressured. Just prior to the Suez Canal blockage, which is a year ago, the outlook was that the disruption we had in the market was likely going to take at least 3 to 4 months to resolve. Then the Suez Canal happened. I did some analysis while the Suez Canal was blocked. And if you assume this would have happened in a normal market, so we didn't have all the disruption, the Suez Canal ripple effects on the supply chain on their own would probably take about 6 months to clean. And before there was even 6 months gone, then we had Yantian shut down because of COVID in China. And before that was ever cleaned, then we had one of the terminals in Ningbo shut down. So it was just one thing on top of another, on top of another, on top of another. That also had a number of ramifications. If we look at some of the delays, Flexport provides a range of different statistics. One of them I like to monitor is what they call the ocean transport time indicator. So this does not measure the sailing time for the vessels. It measures the time it takes from cargo is ready at the exporter until the importer actually takes delivery. So that's longer, of course, than the sailing time on its own. And last year that went from 45 days, which was normal before the pandemic, to 112 days. That is an enormous elongation of the supply chain. There's a lot of cargo suddenly tied up en route. We saw vessel queues that were building up outside Los Angeles, Long Beach. By the end of 2021, they exceeded 100 vessels, and it stayed at 100 vessels for all of January and away into February. I have some words later on where we are now and how long it's going to take to fix. Global reliability dropped down at the end of 2021, so it's only 1 in 3 vessels that actually arrived on time. And making it even worse, for the 2 out of 3 vessels that were not arriving on time, they were on average more than a full week late. That was, of course, a horrible condition. If we looked at many of the trade lanes, they all saw hugely surging spot rates. And in some cases, now clearly not for all of the market, but in some cases, we saw customers willing to pay more than $20,000 per 40-foot container to get either from Asia to Europe or for Asia onto US East Coast as well. This is I would call it the tip of the sword. It's very limited cargo that moves at those extreme levels, but some cargo actually did. We saw charter rates, if we go to the vessel side, that went from vessels that normally fetched $6,000 to $10,000 a day to fetching up to $250,000 a day. Now, of course, these extremely high rates are for relatively short-term charters, but even if you now were looking at your normal long-term charters for say 12 months, they become to a certain element unavailable. It's not a 12-month deal you need to sign up to. It's at least a 3-year deal. And if it's a 3-year deal, then you only pay 5 to 8 times more than what you usually did. So all of 2021 was just one long period where there kept being new disruptions. And if there was not a new disruption, what we then saw was some of the ripple effects from the already existing disruptions. So let's try to dig a little bit more into what is happening right now and how long will this actually take to clean up, because there's a lot of cleanup that needs to happen. Let's look at demand first. One thing that's important to realize about demand is not, from a global perspective, a problem. From a global perspective, we again moved record volumes in 2021, but those volumes are only up something like 5% compared to 2019. So 2 to 3% annual demand growth. This is completely normal, completely in line with expectations pre-pandemic. Global demand is not a problem, not at all. The problem is that the global demand growth is very uneven. And it's North America in particular here that's the only place that's really important, because we continue to see a sharp demand import boom into North America. This started already in summer 2020 after the initial phase of the pandemic, and it continues to this date. The data I'm showing you here is container trade statistics data for January 2022. And what I'm measuring here is the average annual demand growth compared to 2020, so before the pandemic. So on average, we've had a bit over 8% growth into North America consistently for a couple of years. And that was, of course, spiking to an extreme degree last year. This is a major problem because if we have that much demand growth in only one region, that obviously leads to ships being redirected to that region. That has two ripple effects. Ripple effect number one is that increases congestion massively because whilst I can move the ships, I cannot move the ports and terminals. I cannot move the rail lines. I cannot move the trucks. The other ripple effect this has is the vessels that are then being put in to service the US market are vessels that are being removed from virtually all other trades in the world, especially some of the regional trades that suddenly find themselves in a situation where even though they don't have strong demand growth, as we can see here, most regions have normal demand, but not really strong. And in some cases, it's just stagnating. But capacity is being pulled out. So that creates a capacity shortage, even in weak markets. The other thing that's important to note here is that North American exports have plummeted off a cliff. There are two reasons for that. One is the elevation in freight rates. A lot of the exports are relatively low value commodities. They simply cannot pay what it costs with the increased freight rates. The other element is more tied up to equipment imbalances. The carriers are very keen on making sure equipment gets repositioned back to Asia so they can capitalize on the very high headhaul freight rates. That means in some cases, they will simply say no to US export cargo because it pays off better to just ship the container empty. That, of course, creates a lot of political pushback, and I'll get to some of the regulatory implications later on. So we're faced with a world where North America specifically is creating gigantic ripples that affect everywhere else. It does not matter where you are in the world. Doesn't matter if your trade is even negative in volume growth or stagnating. You're having a capacity crunch because of North America. It is as simple as that. And as I mentioned, when we then have this push into initially North America, it leads to congestion. Congestion leads to schedule unreliability. On the left-hand side, what I'm measuring here is the global on-time performance. How many of the deep sea vessels actually arrive on time? And we can see for a decade, the normality was between 70 and 80%. That dropped to 2021 to far below 40%. The newest measurements from January 22 is yet another historical low point. We're now down at 30%. And that's for the global average. In some trades, this is even worse. We've now had several months where the Trans-Pacific specifically is down at 10% on-time arrival. So 9 out of 10 vessels are late. The ones that are late are almost 2 weeks late on average. We also have this slight quirk that for the decade before, when I look across, this is measured by Sea Intelligence for about 35 different trades. Under normal market circumstances, the worst performing trades tend to be the African trades. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. The last few months, some of the African trades are some of the best performing trades in the world in terms of reliability. This is not because Africa has improved, but it's because all the other major trades in the world are now performing even worse than what we normally see in Africa. That's just to give a state of affairs. Now, when vessels are stuck in a queue, that of course means they're not available to move cargo. If I'm sitting there for a month, that's a month my vessel cannot move cargo. So I built a model where I looked at what is the chance that the vessels arrive on time, and for the vessels that don't, how much are they typically delayed? You can use that to calculate effectively how much capacity has therefore been removed from the global fleet. That's what you see on the right-hand side. Under normal circumstances, sure, there are always some delays here and there. So the normal state of affairs is 2% of the global fleet is effectively not available because of queues somewhere. And you can obviously also see what happened here in 2021 and coming into 2022. We are right now at a point where 12.7% of the global fleet is unavailable. This basically means if the market was normal and if we suddenly from one day to the next removed all of CMA CGM's vessels, we would get the same effect. This is why we have a massive shortage of vessel capacity in the world. And we will not resolve this problem until congestion is fixed. Because the carriers can sail the vessels all that they want. Let's imagine that magically they could have their order books delivered tomorrow. The only thing we would accomplish is that all these additional vessels would end up in the same queues. So the way to bring capacity back into the market is to resolve the congestion and the bottlenecks in the various ports. Is the congestion then improving? Well, there are a couple of ways to measure it. Here's the way that I've taken to measuring it over the past year. Hyundai Merchant Marine publishes a customer advisory twice per week, and they look at between 30 and 40 different terminals. And on a range of parameters, they give them green, yellow, or red, depending on the situation. I simply put numbers to that instead. So that allows me for the different regions to create a congestion index. If we start on the left-hand side, that is Europe. We can see how Europe got worse and worse. There was a slight spike in the wake of the Suez Canal in summer 2021, and then it stayed at a fairly high level. Then towards the end of 2021, this became a lot worse, because for the beginning parts of 2021, demand growth was fairly stagnant into Europe. The boom was only in North America, but then demand growth started to pick up, and there was no way the ports apparently could deal with that added inflow. We are now at a point where the index can barely go any higher because virtually all ports are now becoming hopelessly congested. There was a slight downtick on the last measurement here. That is likely to be reversed because what is coming down the pipeline now is a lot of cargo that was supposed to go to Ukraine and Russia that will make congestion even worse in Europe. From an overall perspective, there are no indications that there's any meaningful improvement coming right now on this congestion in Europe. North America also got worse and worse during 2021. There has been a slight improvement by the way this is measured, but that is to be taken with a grain of salt. Let's take Los Angeles, Long Beach, for example. In the beginning of 2022, there was more than 100 vessels waiting to get into Los Angeles and Long Beach. That lasted for over a month. Right now, we are down roughly at about 50 vessels. That has improved over the last 4 weeks. And at first glance, that would look like that is a massive improvement. But there are two things we then need to take into account. One of the reasons why we have a reduction in the queue in Los Angeles is quite a bit of the cargo that would normally be sent to Los Angeles is now being routed on vessels going elsewhere. One of the good examples is it goes to the East Coast to Charleston. In the beginning of the year, when there were 100 vessels in queue outside Los Angeles, the queue at Charleston was 0. Today, the queue outside Charleston is 30 vessels. It is hopelessly congested. And by the way, that now has another ripple effect, because when we had the queue outside Los Angeles, Long Beach, this directly impacted Trans-Pacific. Now that we have queues on the US East Coast, this prevents vessels on the transatlantic trade from Europe to US from running on time. So this is now creating havoc on the supply chain on the Atlantic because of problems in the Pacific that is now spilling over to the US East Coast. This right now is getting worse. It is not getting better. In the Far East, the measurements up until now, you had a spike last year. That was when you had the closures of Yantian and Ningbo, just to give an indication of how big an impact that had. Then we had an improvement in recent months, which basically tells us that it is becoming easier to load the cargo in Asia, but we can't really discharge it in Europe and North America, so it doesn't help very much. Now, with the shutdowns that we have seen in the last few days, particularly in Shenzhen, the obvious fear here is we're going to get a replay of 2021. If that is the case, we could expect the terminal congestion index in the Far East to go back up to the levels we saw in the middle of 2021 over the next couple of weeks. Finally, there's another element coming back to the North American congestion, because as I mentioned, there were two reasons why the queue is declining in Los Angeles. One I mentioned was that some of the cargo is redirected to other ports where we then get queues. And then we have a very practical one. If you look on the left-hand side, what I looked at there was how many weekly departures did we have from Asia to the North American West Coast, fourth quarter last year. And then I looked at the beginning here of 2022, what change did we have? And what we can see is in relation with Chinese New Year, we had a massive decline in the number of vessels going specifically from Asia to North American West Coast. This decline in vessel departures coincide with a drop in the queue outside Los Angeles. So a significant part of the cleanup of the queue in Los Angeles is not because the port has become more effective, but it's simply because fewer vessels started to go there in the first place. Now, the data used here from Sea Intelligence also looks almost 3 months into the future, based on what are the announced schedules and sailings by the carriers. If the carriers continue with their plans, we will now begin to see a sharp increase in the number of vessels going from Asia to the US West Coast, also higher than what we had in Q4. So this would mean, in a base case scenario, we should expect the queues outside California to start growing rapidly again over the coming weeks. And if nothing is done, we will get back up to 100 vessels in a couple of months. Over on the US East Coast, we did not really have a massive decline in the number of vessels going from Asia to US East Coast, even in relation with Chinese New Year. And when we get into April and even worse in May, the plan is for a large additional number of vessels to go to the East Coast into ports which are already heavily congested. So the baseline outlook right now, this is before we start to talk about Chinese shutdown, the baseline outlook is that congestion in North America, if the carriers continue to operate this way, congestion in North America will deteriorate significantly over the next 2 months, getting even worse than what it is now. All of these delays will further remove effective capacity from the market. And of course, this removal of effective capacity is what has led to an extreme increase in charter rates. It's a pure arbitrage. Why, conceptually, why would I operate a small vessel, say between, let's say, India and Sri Lanka and over to Singapore and back, if I can take the same vessel, put it into the Trans-Pacific and have somebody pay $15,000 per FFE? It is as simple as that. That has led to a reduction of smaller vessels in intra-Asia, in Africa, in intra-Caribbean, to some degree in intra-Europe, where these smaller vessels are now being deployed on the Trans-Pacific trade and on the Asia-Europe trade. We've even had cases of vessels below 1,000 TEU in size operate between Asia and Europe, which under normal circumstances would be out of the question. But as long as the freight rate levels are as high as they are, it makes all the economic sense in the world to do this. This removes capacity from all the regional trades. It pushes up the freight rates in those regional trades. And on the topic of freight rates, are rates actually declining? I mean, for anyone who has followed the shipping press, at least for the last couple of weeks, there are increasing headlines, especially related to, for example, Asia-Europe, that spot rates are now dropping rapidly. And sure, over the last month or so, spot rates have dropped maybe $2,000 per 40 foot. And in a normal world, a freight rate decline of $2,000 per 40 foot would be astronomical. But look on the left-hand side. This is from the World Container Index. The blue line on the left-hand side is the spot rate from Asia to Europe. And look at that $2,000 decline here in the last few weeks in 2022. 2,000 sounds like a lot, but in reality, when we put this into context, it matters almost nothing. We remain at astronomically high level on all the headhaul rates on Asia, Europe, on transatlantic, on Trans-Pacific, despite the declines we have seen after Chinese New Year. The red one on the left-hand side is the backhaul rate. And whilst it doesn't look like much, for backhaul shippers that are critically dependent on very low freight rates, this is a financial disaster. They have seen their rate levels double and triple to points where for quite a few of them, they don't have a viable business model. But then we come back to why I started with the congestion, because the congestion needs to be resolved to free up the vessels. So unless we solve congestion, we don't free up the vessels. If we don't free up the vessels, we will continue to see the smaller vessels go into these big deep sea trades because freight rate levels still justify doing just that. And despite the drop, as I mentioned, we've seen on Asia, Europe recently, it is not really a large, meaningful drop as yet. The effect of pulling smaller vessels over to the deep sea trades is continuing and will be continuing for the coming weeks because there is no indication that port congestion is becoming resolved. On the topic of port congestion, I was mentioning the examples of North America before, but what about Europe? Part of the challenge in Europe is they are now going to be impacted by some of the fallout from the war between Russia and Ukraine. And let's just look at what we know we have of impact rather than speculate to start with. We already know many operators have stopped taking bookings to Ukraine, to Russia, and actually to Belarus as well. That in itself leads to a problem because when this started, there were, of course, tens of thousands of containers already on the ships en route going to Ukraine and Russia. These vessels are now arriving in the Eastern Mediterranean ports, in Black Sea ports, and in North European ports. So we'll have Russian and Ukrainian cargo being discharged. And once it's been discharged, it has nowhere to go. So this is now piling up in ports that were already heavily congested even before this happened. This will make the congestion worse. It will make it even more difficult to clean up the congestion problem that we manifestly already have. In some ports in North Europe, the port workers have gone to the point of saying they don't want to handle Russian cargo, which means that some of the shipping lines have already told customers that if you have cargo on my ship going into St. Petersburg, it will stay on the vessel. It will not be dumped in Rotterdam or Hamburg. It will stay on the vessel and go back to origin. That, of course, means it will not add to the congestion in the port. But the problem here is the Russian cargo is not necessarily the boxes that stand in the bottom of the ship. So in order to discharge all the other cargo, you're going to have to discharge the Russian cargo and then load it back onto the ship again, which means it will take more time to handle the vessel. The vessel will spend more time in port, which will also add to the congestion problems that we do see. Adding to that, we've had some of the extreme spikes we saw recently in bunker fuel prices. In a normal world, an almost doubling of bunker fuel prices up to more than $1,000 a ton would be the most important thing that had happened. But given the extremely high freight rates we see in the market, this is a non-event. Sure, bunker fuel surcharges will increase, but compared to the astronomically high freight rates, at least on the major deep sea trades, it is more or less a non-event. This will be more important in the longer term. So the knock-on impact we're already beginning to see now is more congestion in European terminals, and we're already seeing increases in bunker fuel surcharges. That is the known impact. We then have a few additional impacts. Technically speaking, the Russian railways is still operating. Technically speaking, you can still load cargo on the rail line in China and move it to Europe. More and more operators have instituted a booking stop. For a lot of the Western companies, this is related to sanctions. Increasingly, I'm beginning to see also, for example, some Chinese forwarders instituting a booking stop, not because of sanctions, but for a risk management perspective. You don't know in the current environment whether the rail line will stop operating tomorrow. So they don't want to put more cargo into a very fragile supply chain. And in some cases, when it comes to Russian cargo, the fear is simply that the customer is unable to pay. So that means all the cargo that used to go overland from China to Europe now have to go on the vessels, and you already have capacity issues on Asia-Europe. That will add an upwards pressure on the spot rates on Asia-Europe in the short term. That was, of course, a lot of challenges that we're faced with right ahead of us. And I have this view, this industry is almost like a lot of dominoes that topple each other over. Some of the problems can be predicted far in advance. And even in a best case scenario, there is one more ripple effect that will hit the market, and we haven't seen it yet. And the best place to see that one is in North America. So I made the model here. It's specific for North America, but it will have serious ramifications. Remember when I told you earlier that the normal transport time was 45 days from China to the US, today is 112 days. That means we have a lot of containers tied up in the supply chain. I then built a model and was optimistic and say, let's assume all operations are normal by the end of 2022. So gradually the 112 days goes back to 45 days. But that means that more than 2 months worth of import cargo is now being turned into empty containers in North America, in addition to the normal flow. This corresponds to more than 3 million TEU of equipment. And there will be 0 additional vessel capacity to move this equipment back to Asia, because that will be handling the normal flow. So as we progress, if we progress rapidly towards an operational normalization, we will begin to see an effect where empty depots and terminals will suddenly become overwhelmed by the influx of empty equipment. And you will then reach physically a point where the importers that have taken delivery of their cargo have no place to then return the empty equipment. This will be less of an issue in Europe, and I don't have a full model of other parts around the world, but there will be elements of this everywhere. Part of this severe equipment shortage we've seen in the last 2 years is, strictly speaking, not because we didn't have enough containers in the world. We do have enough containers in the world, but because of the lengthening of the supply chain, we needed a lot more containers to cater for that time. The moment the supply chains go back to their normal time, we'll have millions of empty containers discharged into empty depots, and we will not physically have the capacity to handle them. So even in a best case scenario where the world becomes normal, there is one more domino effect that's going to cause disruption down the path. This timeline is for if we get to normality by the end of 2022. But of course, the question is, how long will this take to fix? One benchmark that we can use is 2015. You had a problem between the port workers union and the terminals on the US West Coast. And at that point in time, early 2015, there were 40 vessels in line outside of California. It was the worst congestion we'd seen in decades back then. And from the point where the port workers got a new deal until this congestion was fully resolved and everything was normal, it took 8 months. This was at a time where the problem only existed on the US West Coast. Today, the problem is global. Today, the problem also exists inland. So the absolutely best case scenario would be 8 months to fix the current problem. Best case. Realistically, it's going to take longer. On top of that, we now, of course, have the Russia-Ukraine war, which will prolong the time it takes to fix congestion in Europe, because now we're just adding to the congestion courtesy of the war. And if we look in China, this is where things become really, really tricky. I have for the last 3 months warned that one of the largest potential problems in 2022 would be major shutdowns of port and terminal infrastructure in China due to COVID. If you look over the last 2 days, this is going to be interesting. Let's put it that way. Technically speaking, ports and terminals are not closed in China. They remain open. Also the ones down in Shenzhen, also the Yantian. But warehouses are closed. Factories are closed. A lot of the truck drivers cannot operate. So it doesn't help us very much that the port is open, because clearly the cargo cannot get to and from the port, and it is not even being produced in a number of the factories. This has the potential of being a complete replay of the very first pandemic phase in February 2020, where a lot of China also shut down. That means that the play out over the coming weeks will be a sharp drop in exports out of China, because a lot of the factories and warehouses are closed. That means with a 3-week time delay, this will help congestion on the US West Coast. With a 4 to 5 week time delay, this will help congestion in Europe and US East Coast. But that does not mean that we are home free, because once China then starts to reopen, there will be a colossal surge of cargo, exactly the same as we saw in 2020. Because when the factories and the logistics supply chains reopen, they need to catch up what they lost during the shutdown. That means that an enormous amount of vessels will then leave Asia, going to US West Coast, US East Coast, and Europe. And then we're going to have another round of massive congestion we need to work our way out of. It's not a question of whether this is going to happen. It will, because we can see that from the shutdowns. It's only a matter of how big is it going to be and how long is it going to take. In terms of how big is it going to be, my perspective on that is that depends on when China decides to abandon the zero tolerance policy. Because from a practical perspective, as we have seen in every other country around the world, the new Omicron variant cannot be effectively contained. It is simply too contagious. So if China insists on a zero tolerance policy, we will continue to see major impact of shutdowns in China until they modify that policy. So that's the major risk looking ahead of us. But the longer it takes for the Chinese to change their policy, the more we are going to see 2022 play out exactly as the early parts of 2020. That is a lot of bad news, let's just call it that. But what if we start to look further out? Because one thing is that we want to transition back to something normal, but we should also look at this from a slightly different perspective. Not only is 22 and 23 a transition coming out of pandemic and back into normal, but it's also a period where all supply chain stakeholders are in a positioning game for the rest of the decade. There are several things here. There's already a lot of groundwork in motion. These relate to digital standards. It relates to investments in new technology and automation, getting employees and customers accustomed to this. There are multiple companies out there that are already running full steam ahead of this, and make absolutely no mistake. When you get towards 2030, if you are not fully digital and really good at this, you will not exist unless you are very small and have a very specific niche. Then we had all the normalization of the operations. We partly touched on that already. And then there's going to be a major battle between the logistics operators. I have more of that one in a second. So for 22 and 23, don't just think of it as a period where we have to get back to normal. You have to think of this also as a positioning time, where this is where you build the foundation for whether you will be successful out to 2030 or whether you will cease to exist. So looking at some of the challenges and new normalities, we already in 2023 are going to see new environmental regulations under IMO 2023. And to put it very simply, this means every individual vessel needs to have a certain level of energy efficiency. If the vessel does not live up to that, either you need to put it into a yard to retrofit it to make it more efficient, or you need it to go slower. Realistically, for a lot of these vessels, they will need to go slower. And if you look at an overview of the global fleet, not surprisingly, the ultra-large container vessels, they're perfectly fine. There's not an issue with them. The Neo-Panamaxes, at least half of them are perfectly fine. It's not really a major issue. Small vessels is a big problem. For all the smaller segments, it's typically 20 to 30% only that comply with the new regulations. This means a sizable part of the fleet that is used in regional and feeder trades will have to slow down. So we could very well end up in the practical situation in 2023, 2024, where we will have plenty of capacity on the main deep sea trades. Keep in mind, we have a very large order book. In TEU terms, it's historically large. In percentage, it's actually not historically large, but it is a large order book. But this is predominantly large vessels, not small vessels. So we will very likely head into a period where we'll have plenty of capacity on the deep sea trades, but we might still have capacity shortages in regional trades. That will mean that we will continue to see relatively high charter rates for vessels in the smaller segments. And we will be in the unusual situation that the freight rate spread between moving from main port to main port and then outport to main port will increase dramatically because the big vessel is fine, but the feeder leg might end up being costly. Now, of course, if this scenario plays out, the logical next step is we're going to see an ordering boom in smaller tonnage, which we very likely will see. The ordering boom we had over the last year was predominantly in larger vessels. So we are likely going to see a surge in orders for the small and medium-sized container vessels, but they're not going to be delivered until 2025. So we're going to have this temporary period of 23, 24, where we're actually going to skew the market between the regional markets and the deep sea markets. If we then look at the deep sea markets, we're going to see a new rate normality. And let's separate very cleanly here between head hauls and back hauls. On the head hauls, what we will experience is freight rates will definitely come down a lot compared to where they are now. Right now, they're driven by shortages. But the new normality will be freight rate levels that are much higher sustainably compared to what we have been used to in the past. The carriers are much more consolidated. This would have happened anyway, even in the absence of the pandemic. They are much more consolidated. They are much better at managing their capacity. And if anything, we have seen over the last couple of years, the willingness to pay amongst at least some of the very large shippers is much higher than was ever imagined. So the baseline, I have a small graph on that one in a second, is for head haul freight rates, the expectation should be stabilization at a level much higher than what we've been used to. Backhaul freight rates, they are likely to eventually come back down to pre-pandemic levels, because this is where we have the low value commodity shippers, where their business models simply will not work, even at the rate levels we have now. The only reason why they are still in trouble now is related to the equipment imbalances, which again is caused by all the supply chain bottlenecks. Once the operations come back down to normal, we come back to normal flows in empty repositioning, backhaul freight rates should be expected to come back down to pre-pandemic levels. This will, of course, create an environment where we've already been used to a massive rate difference between head haul and backhaul rates. That difference will be even larger as the new normal going forward. We will have fewer price wars amongst the major carriers. If you look at the last couple of decades, the normal state of affairs was basically they were always in a price war somewhere. Then on a few short occasions, there was not a price war. Going forward, the balance between those two will be reversed. There will still be a price war every now and then, but they will be much more short-lived. And conceptually, think about it this way. This is the China contract freight index on the Trans-Pacific over the last 24 years. And what you can basically see is there was a slow declining trend from 1998 until 2014. Of course, vessels got slightly larger, costs got down. Then there's a level shift in 2016 to 2020, which was driven by the major rate war the carriers had in 2015. Then we have the spike from the current pandemic. Going forward, here's what is extremely likely to happen. First, contract rates will start to come down, obviously, but it's going to take them a year and a half at least to come down, even if they're in free fall. I mean, the arrow I'm showing you here, that's a year and a half. And how far are they then going to come down? Well, they are likely going to find a new level that is more or less on par with where we were in the beginning of 2021. Now, why do I say beginning of 2021? Because if I look at the contract rates, who is it that are the predominant beneficiaries of the contract rates? Those, in this case, are the major US importers. Those are Walmart, it's Target, it's Home Depot, it's Dole Foods, all customers that are moving hundreds of thousands, in some cases, millions of containers. All of these companies, when you look at their annual accounts for 2021, had record high profits. None of their business models suffered materially because of the contract rates they paid in 2021. On the other hand, these very large importers, they had a large competitive advantage because all the small importers, they could not get the good contract rates. They had to move on spot. So the large importers have a distinct competitive advantage in the high freight rate environment. They don't necessarily have an interest in rates dropping further than that. Now, mind you, in 2022, contract rates on Trans-Pacific are likely to be twice what they were in 2021, much higher. That will then start to come back down in 2023. When they come down, we will likely have a small price war, because over the last 6 months, there's a number of new small container lines that have started services, specifically on Trans-Pacific and a few also in Asia, Europe, using this extremely expensive charter tonnage. When the market starts to normalize, it's quite likely that there will be a small price war where the large carriers will drive these smaller players out of the market again. Once that price war is over, we will then see this stabilization, of course, with the usual seasonality and volatility, but a stabilization at a level substantially higher than what we have been used to in the past. And that's just on the rate side in terms of what's going to transpire. Looking further ahead, this is already underway. I call it the five-way battlefield for cargo control. We have the cargo owners. To a large degree in many trades, a lot of that cargo is controlled by the traditional freight forwarders. We can call them forwarders or NVOs or logistics providers. I'll just use the term forwarders interchangeably for all of them. But this is under pressure. You have container carriers increasingly wanting to provide logistics and end-to-end services. Of course, most notable would be Maersk and CMA, but more and more carriers are proceeding down this path. They will be regaining part of this. Then we have the born digital freight forwarders. Those are the ones like Flexport, like Forto. There's a lot of them out there. And the battle that goes on between the traditional ones and the digital carriers are the traditional forwarders are rapidly trying to become digital. They need to. The digital forwarders have found out that, of course, you cannot be a freight forwarder by only having computers and software. There's a physical element to the industry, so they're rapidly trying to build that one up. On top of this battle, we are beginning increasingly to see container terminals by logistics companies and sometimes by regional container lines. They want to create a logistics proposition that ties the cargo owners to their specific terminal. And then we have some of the very large diversified cargo owners, especially Amazon and Alibaba, also joining into this fight. This, of course, does not create any more cargo in itself. These are 5 different entities that will be fighting over the existing cargo owners. The container carriers, the advantage they have right now is they have an enormous amount of cash, given the profitability. They are going to have a combined profitability of roughly $150 billion in 2021. They are likely to be even more profitable in 2022. These hundreds of billions of dollars, to a significant degree, will be spent on acquiring logistics companies to build up their size in this. They will become formidable. Some of the digital forwarders, especially Flexport, for example, also have an enormous war chest. Flexport just got another capital injection from investors of just shy of $1 billion. Forto just got $250 million. They can afford to buy market share for a long, long time to come with this. So this is going to unfold. It's not going to be resolved in a year or two. We're going to see massive acquisitions here in 2022 on the back of all this money. But the end game you need to think through here is, in very, very round numbers, you got 100,000 freight forwarders around the world. When we get to the 2030, by the end of the decade, tens of thousands of those forwarders will not exist anymore. We are going to go through a massive consolidation phase. That does not mean that all freight forwarders will disappear, obviously not, but a lot will. And if we start to look at who will likely be some of the winners and losers in this game, the very large freight forwarders have a distinct competitive advantage. They will still be here. Very small freight forwarders that have very specific niche propositions, typically linked to either very unique cargo types, very unique customers, or very unique geographies, they will do well as well. The main losers in this game will be the very broad group of small to medium-sized freight forwarders. They will be under significant pressure. Now, mind you, I'm not saying they will all be gone, because clearly they won't, but these tens of thousands that will disappear will in the major form be medium and small-sized freight forwarders that will be the losers in this battle. And almost every week that goes by right now sees more interesting elements. One thing I fell over last week, that was HapagLloyds annual account. Now I'm going to read this one aloud to you because it is actually critically important. This is what HapagLloyd themselves says, a possible expansion of the services and collaboration within THE Alliance, for example, into hinterland transport, could provide additional growth opportunities. So what HapagLloyd is alluding to here is the alliances that up until now principally has been a construct that operates on the vessels on the sea. HapagLloyd is pointing towards an imminent future where the scope of some of these alliances can now reach inland as well. That adds further pressure to this five-way battle of logistics I mentioned before. So to try to sum up where we're going to be in 2030, we could have spent the whole hour talking about the greening of the supply chain. I chose not to do that one. That might be a topic for the future. But basically, these green vessels need to be ordered before 2030, because otherwise we're not going to meet some of the targets. The carriers are in all likelihood going to accelerate this agenda. We are also looking at a completely different part of the industry, because when we get to 2030, we're at a point where even some of the oldest 15,000 TEU vessels reach the end of their lifespan. If at the same time, we're seeing a rapid acceleration in carbon neutral vessels being built, we will see a lot of vessel scrapping in the container sector towards 2030. There are not really enough responsible scrapping solutions out there to actually handle this. This is going to be yet another problem in the shipping industry that is not well thought out as it is right now. How are we going to scrap all of these ships, especially as we start to go through the decarbonization process? That is unresolved. Digitalization, when we get to 2030, is not really a major topic. At that point in time, everyone that is still in existence will have been thoroughly digitized, because otherwise they will not be existing anymore. It really is as simple as that. And the simplest way to think about this is, no matter whether you're a shipping line or forwarder or who you are in the chain, you've got to get to the point where, as long as everything goes according to plan, all information exchange is completely automated. Nobody touches it. But we also know that this is an industry where things do not always go according to plan. So where the value add is, and the ones that want to stay alive and live well, they will focus on making sure they have the best people on hand to then come up with plan B or plan C when things do not go according to plan. So you need to digitize to stay in the game, but you also need extremely skilled people to provide that value-added service on top that the customers are going to require. And I can see on the slide, there's a typo. I say thousands of forwarders that will disappear. That should actually have another zero. It should be tens of thousands. The last slide I want to put in here is for some of the major risk elements that are ahead of us. We have the COVID shutdowns in China. This is moving from a risk to a reality already, as we are seeing right now in Shenzhen, for example. And of course, the spectrum is this could get a lot worse. Cyber attacks. Do not underestimate the disruptive potential of that as well. Keep in mind, 5 years ago, when Maersk was completely brought down for a week, and it took them several weeks to come back up and running, this was a Russian cyber attack on Ukraine 5 years ago. And they didn't even target Maersk. They only targeted Ukraine as a whole. 7,000 companies got hit. The risk right now is dedicated cyber attacks from Russia against critical infrastructure, which will mean also shipping lines, forwarders, ports, and terminals. This could create even more disruption in the current supply chains. As I mentioned, we're going to see a lot of thing going wrong in the integration process. We are seeing potential new regulations. The first one that's coming will be the Ocean Shipping Reform Act over in the US. There will also be regulation related to carbon taxation, for example. The risk going forward for the industry is if this regulation is not sufficiently thought through, we might have large unintended side consequences that potentially could make things worse as well. As I mentioned before, there's going to be serious CSR issues related to vessel scrapping. And if we really look at this over the next decade, there's also an increasing likelihood of more trade wars and more sanctions. So we get a much more fragmented market compared to the ones we've actually been used to over the last few decades, where the world has become more and more cohesive. We might see an opposite trend. That means that for some, this will actually present huge opportunities, because if you're good at dealing with a highly complex supply chain, a more fragmented world is actually a commercial opportunity and not so much a risk. That takes me through what I had chosen to put in the slides here. And I think before we head into the Q&A, I think the idea is there's a small word from our sponsors. I believe the organizers need to put on a movie of some sorts.
Yes, Lars. Just give us a few seconds. We will play a video for our sponsor, and then we will get into the Q&A.
China SOC Line is a common feeder carrier with head office located in Shanghai. We provide immediate SOC space solutions to our clients globally with excellent customer services. We have a high-efficient SOC team and a professional SOC agency network worldwide to provide 24/7 response to our clients' requests with fast, efficient, flexible, innovative at the core service concept. CSL is working closely with most carriers and box operators all over the world. At present, CSL service scope covers China, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, India, Pakistan, and Middle East areas. At the same time, CSL is developing into Europe, Africa, Oceanic, and American continents. We look forward to working with you together. And please feel free to send your inquiry to us at any time.
Yeah, so that's a quick message from our event sponsor, China SOC Lines. We really thank them for sponsoring this event. And also we would like to mention our other corporate sponsor, that is South Asia Gateway Terminals from Sri Lanka. So we would like to thank both of our sponsors, giving this opportunity for many viewers all around the world to listen to Lars. Of course, now it's opportunity for all the participants to get into a Q&A, ask questions, and make use of this great opportunity with Lars to ask questions. So I don't see much questions still in the chat box. Maybe you can raise your hand so that we can let you ask your questions going by the name.
On in now. Lars, sorry, my Robots Vice Chairman of the ICS London branch. I'll just put a question in the chat box. In your opinion, are ship operators with their surface fleet of container ships focusing on being digitally ready with their ships, or more on the preparedness for the reduction in carbon emissions?
I don't think it's an either or. I see those movements. Let me try to answer this one slightly differently, and then slap me over the head and ask again if it's not a proper answer. I see them do both at the same time. On one hand, you have the whole digital transformation. I see them increasingly moving down a path of employing IoT devices as much as humanly possible, not just on the ships, but also on the containers, also on landside equipment, to simply get as much transparency as humanly possible to optimize their operations. That's one side of it. On the decarbonization, maybe I should add a few more words on that. I see a development over the coming years. I fully expect the decarbonization on the container side. I don't have a view on the bulkers and tankers, but on the container side, that the major carriers will accelerate this transformation as rapidly as possible. And some would call me a cynic. I would like to be a realist. I don't see this primarily being driven by concern for the environment. The environment will benefit, make no doubt about it, but it's not the primary driver. There are two other drivers, and they're financial. One thing is, if I decarbonize my fleet, that means I have to be dependent on electrofuels. So either methanol or ammonia or whatever. And the point with these fuels are, I can produce them irrespective of the energy source. So if I produce green methanol, I can use solar, I can use wind, I can use nuclear power, I can burn coal and old rags for all I care. It's all energy. So what you do by decarbonizing the fleet is you make yourself independent of the energy source. So you have a choice. And that means you can always choose to then use the cheapest possible energy source. I then also happen to believe that some of the green energies will over time also become the most cost efficient ones, but that's a different argument. But one part of it is the carriers will decarbonize because they want to be independent of the energy source. The second thing, that's why they will do it. The second thing in terms of why will they accelerate it? Again, it's in their own self-interest. If you accelerate decarbonization, I mean, Maersk have put out 2040 as a timeline, which is extremely aggressive. But if you do this aggressively, that means in order to stay in the game, you need to invest an enormous amount of money in renewing your fleet faster than normal. That will raise entry barriers. It will make it more difficult for new container lines to come in and compete. The normal way in as a new carrier is, of course, to go out and charter some of the older tonnage. That older tonnage will suddenly become enormously unattractive and unappealing in this environment. And the existing players will be forced to put much larger investments on the table to even stay in the game. So the carriers will decarbonize because that makes sense from a financial perspective on the fuel, and they will accelerate it because that will raise entry barriers to competitors. The main bottleneck I see here is not the carriers, especially not with all the money they got now. The main bottleneck is the fuel providers. Will they physically be able to make enough fuel? You may have seen Maersk came out just a few days ago with a new agreement with some of the fuel providers to make 700,000 tons of green methanol for Maersk's 16,000 TEU ships. As an extremely rough ballpark, if we want to decarbonize all of shipping, 700,000 TEU is nothing. And then we need 800 million tons instead of 700,000. So it's more down to how quickly can we produce enough fuel.
It's a very interesting point, and I thank you very much for your analysis on that, because within my sector, being in container operations, is the fact that Maersk have gone head forwards with this new green fuel, but they seem to slightly reduce the size of their ship. You know, you've got some of the major alliances going mega max, you know, the phenomenally sized large size ships of 23,000 TEU capacity, and Maersk has gone, well, we've built those types of ships, we've looked at the EEE class and the energy efficiency, we're actually looking at now 16,000 TEU, and that will be on the Asia-Europe trade. So it's quite interesting to see the mindset or someone who can sort of.
No, but it is interesting, but that's down a slightly different path. I won't say I'm surprised. I mean, I've had the view for basically the last 10 years that the 18 to 24,000 TEUs was a step too far. It's almost like the ultra large oil carriers back in the 1970s. We keep building them bigger and bigger until we get a step too far. I made an analysis that's almost a decade ago now, where a client gave me a hypothetical question. Say, when you increase vessel sizes, how much do you save? And not from the perspective of a carrier. From a carrier, it's a no-brainer. Every time I make the vessel larger, I reduce fuel consumption per TEU. But there are externalities when I go up in size. It means that I need to do more transshipment at times because I have fewer weekly services. The ports need to invest in larger infrastructure. You create much more challenges on the inland side the larger the ships are. So if you took all of that into account, under that study, going from 10 to 14,000 TEU, that's a good idea. You do save holistically in the supply chain. 14 to 18,000 TEU was a break even. 18 to, at that time, conceptually a 25,000 TEU ship was an outright loss for the supply chain as a whole. And when I look at part of the challenge we're faced with now is you have the ultra large vessels, but they've come at the expense of reduced service frequency. Reduced service frequency means fewer direct port bears, meaning more transshipment. So my view for years has been that you would see this retrograde move. You would see a step down to basically the Neo-Panamax size, because that gives a better balance between the unit cost on the ship and the impact you have on the network. So I don't think sustainably we're going to see larger ships. I would not be surprised if you saw, for example, a COSCO go ahead with a 27 or 28,000 TEU ship, mainly to have the bragging rights of doing it. But basically these ultra large ones, I see them as the Airbus A380s of shipping. They're too large to be commercially the right choice.
Thank you. No, it's very interesting to speak to you. Thank you for your opinion. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Mike, for the questions. I think that helped us to learn more from Lars. Any more questions we have from the participants? It's your turn now. Yeah.
Is it my turn? It's Jeffrey.
Yes, Mr. Daniel, you can ask.
Okay, it's my turn.
Yes, please go.
Yes, my name is Daniel. It's my great honor to be the event sponsor to invite Mr. Lars to give us the speech. Thank you very much. My question is regarding the digitalization, which now is, all the carriers or actually logistic industry is much focused on this topic. We are a common feeder carrier, except, we run our service or operate vessels. We found that, those bigger shipping lines, they are actually not utilize their space in certain sectors, like short legs. So in the past 10 years, we try to develop on this subject. Another side, we offer the space to our clients, which they have the container, even some carriers, even some box operators. Another side, we get the slot from certain sectors of the bigger carriers, which they are not utilized. And now we trying to develop this, business model in the digital way. Last year, we invited IBM, the company, as the consultant company for the digitalization platform. But during the process, that's interesting for me to find that, if you compare the shipping line and with the airline, the passengers, actually, they have a very good capacity control system. In the world, actually, there's 2 or 3, bigger systems, like a global distribution system. All the carriers' capacity, they can be managed very easily in a second. When you book a ticket in a second. But when we started the shipping line, the carriers, We found out that all the shipping lines, they even play on their own. Maybe Maersk is the one who are advanced. Even some carriers, they don't have even a system. I mean, still give me my impression that they keep calling, they keep Excel. There's a head office, the line manager has a lot of struggling with the local sales. They are trying to play each other's. So in the shipping line, there's no such a system for this. So I want to try to understand. I try to understand, ask what's the reason?
No.
How we should do that, and what can we do for the shipping in this industry?
You're absolutely right. There's a huge discrepancy across the carriers in terms of their IT maturity. Some of the ones that are most advanced right now would be Maersk and HapagLloyds for that matter, as well as probably some of the ones that are the furthest ahead. Then you have a number of other carriers that are far, far behind. To some degree, it reflects the development before the pandemic, where you still had a lot of carriers that might say, well, IT is important, but they had really neglected to do a lot of development. And when they made development, it was small patches here and there. A lot of the carriers have the problem that their backend systems are 20 years old. And for a lot of those, they don't necessarily dare touch them because what if something goes wrong? And they're, of course, increasingly under pressure now. Then what I see as a sign of a good development was the launch of the DCSA, the Digital Container Shipping Association, a couple of years ago, just before the pandemic, because the carriers also realized the problem is there are no standards. And when we say no standards, it's down to the most ridiculous things where the carriers were not even aligned on what is the timestamp for a vessel that has arrived at port. And if you want interoperability and shared data, this basic has to be in place. DCSA has actually developed quite a lot of good standards over the last 2 years. The problem is there's still a number of the carriers that have not implemented the standards. And this is where I see an interesting phenomenon right now, because the carriers now do have the money to really invest heavily in IT. But they don't have the manpower internally, because if we are a bit honest here, what is the most important thing for a carrier right now? That is to make as much money as humanly possible on the strongest upcycle that they have ever seen. So whilst they would like to have this digital transformation, that is going to come with a slight time lag in terms of when they will implement it. But when it does, it's going to transition extremely rapidly. Let me give two examples on how quick it can go. One from a carrier, one from a forwarder. From a carrier side, it's interesting to look at HapagLloyds, and just as an example, they're quick quotes. Now, of course, digital is many different things. Online sale is just one of them. But when Hapag launched quick quotes, that was in second half of 2018. They sold 0% online. Then they had a strategic target that by 2023, they should be up to 15%. Their latest annual account had for 2021 had them at 22.7% already, and that is growing rapidly. So all the other carriers will be forced to follow down that path. Otherwise, they will lose access to, in this case, the spot market. Another element is not really IT related at all. That was a forwarder, let's call them a medium-sized forwarder, that I spoke to a few months ago out in Asia. They had an experience where they lost tender for a client. It's a client they had for many years. And of course, that happens. So they got a meeting with the client just to find out, okay, why? They already knew they lost the business, but why? As it turned out, they get into the meeting. The client has got a new, younger logistics manager. And they told, and he said to them, well, you don't do X, Y, and Z online. And the forwarder said, no, and you know that, but I mean, you have our cell phone numbers. We are always there for you. You've always been happy because we are there for you. You can call us anytime. And the new younger logistics manager just looked at them and say, yeah, I know I can call you, but I don't want to. It's as simple as that. So as you get this generational change, there's going to be an enormous push. And just like you have a lot of forwarders that will be challenged if they don't go down this path, there are even larger lines. If they don't get their act together relatively quickly, their future is also in jeopardy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lars.
Hi, Jeffrey, it's your turn. You can unmute and ask.
Thank you very much indeed. Lars, this has been fascinating. And I'm very grateful to you for opening up our eyes to what you think the future will hold. I have a question which is partly based on what you have already explained, but in my humble opinion, you might perhaps go further. And that is regarding cybersecurity and cyber warfare, which you mentioned earlier, and we are certainly aware of what happened to Maersk and no doubt to others as well. And not only in the liner world, mostly container ships, not only, but also obviously in the much bigger world of tramp ships. Mm-hmm. The question is, how will increased cybersecurity be possible? And do you think, do you agree with me, that this could be a huge opportunity for those who are involved in maintaining security for others, in other words, the IT professionals, to prevent cyber warfare against multimodal transport, not just sea, but precisely for the reasons you mentioned. With the, I think you said the new report that came out, I think you said yesterday. I'm not sure if I've lost you or whether you can still hear me. I hope you can still hear me. I think there was an internet connection problem.
Yeah, now
So
you're back on. I got the first
very
half of your question, not the other half.
Okay, I'm so sorry. There seems to be some internet problem. I'm not quite sure why. So the second half is, do you believe that do you agree that there is an opportunity and a need for greater security companies, cyber security companies, to help those who are involved with multimodal transport, straight liner shipping, and also tramp shipping? Because that seems to be, unfortunately, the way of criminals nowadays, or shall we say certain countries.
No, I mean, to elaborate on that, the cyber threat is very real, has been for many years. It has not been taken serious by this industry at all, as it should have. And that goes both for cybersecurity for landside operations and also cybersecurity on the vessels themselves. I see an industry where basically all companies, unless you are extremely large, you haven't got the slightest hope of having the relevant expertise in-house. That is simply not feasible. There is a shortage of people with good cybersecurity skills. You cannot conceivably hope to have all that in-house. Now, that being said, there's a lot of misconceptions about cybersecurity. There's this misconception that it's a hacker sitting in a basement coming up with something completely new to target just you. Nothing could be further from the truth. The vast majority of cyber attacks happens either because you are operating unpatched old systems. So update your systems constantly. It's as simple as that. And another large part of it is you very often get a good hack by good old-fashioned conmanship. You trick people to doing something they shouldn't do, logging onto sites they shouldn't log onto. So a lot of this is down to human behavior. Can you be safe? Of course you cannot be safe. My favorite example is always, can I put a bomb inside a container port and blow it up? Of course I can. But it's a lot more difficult than it was 20 years ago when we increased the security barriers. So this is not about making it impossible, it's about making it less likely. And the second thing, bear in mind, if we just forget the cyber warfare done by nation states, that's a different ballgame. But for all the criminals, this is an industry. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. They do this for the money. And if you look like you're at least doing something on the cyber front, they're more likely to go to your neighbor instead. It's also as simple as that.
I have thank you for that. And that's exactly what I was hoping you would say. I have a follow-on question in that case. Do you agree that much more basic training should be given to those who are at sea? Because it is our ratings, our officers at sea who are logging on for their weekly chat or their daily email correspondence with their loved ones at home, who may well be logging on to sites which might entice them, and they shouldn't be there.
No, yeah, there needs to be some training, but I think it should be in a slightly different vein. I mean, I'm not involved in it now, but a few years ago, I was co-founder and involved in a cybersecurity firm. We were some of the guys that you would call to actually try to hack your systems. We had people on board vessels. And a recurrent theme that we always found on every vessel, almost without fail, is on the blueprint, you would have completely different systems. You had one system for navigation, you had one for mechanical and vessel operations, and a separate system for crew welfare where the crew would log on, for example, which security-wise makes all the sense in the world. When you physically go on board the ship, they were never separated because you always have something that breaks down. Now the router broke down, so what? We'll just buy a new router in the next port and we'll just plug it in. Yes, it works, but there is no awareness of what that does to the security posture. And I've stopped counting the number of times. Now I was about to say almost do it for fun. I was on a cruise. That was just before the pandemic. And like they do, they like to entertain their guests. So they said, does anybody want to have a tour of the engine room? Yeah, sure, why not? And as always, I took pictures, and one of the pictures I was almost as always was on the computers down there, not with a post-it, but a laminated note saying, here's the admin username and password. We see that all the time. And that's not about doing something technically difficult. It's a mentality change in how we deal with this.
Thank you.
I'll just come in there, Jeff, because
Thank you.
sorry, Lars, I'm ship ops, you see, and I'll support what Lars says. I think probably the London branch will have a webinar on it. We'll have Lars as well. I've just done a podcast on cybersecurity from a ship ops point of view, and as Lars say, it's just about basic housekeeping sometimes. You know, I don't. We joking within our committee about beard colour and things like that, and I'll let you into an age. You know, I've got a 4. My age starts with a 4, but I'm actually one of the old school that need educating. It's the cyber security, and of course, for the seafarers' age of mine and above, the good proportion that are uneducated, whereas the people coming through the system, they're actually educated. And it's about, I think a lot of it's just down the house. Most shipping companies should actually have that cyber security risk assessment.
Oh, the interesting part is if you come from a state where you haven't really done anything about cybersecurity, improving your security posture dramatically is fairly simple and extremely low cost because it's not about buying a lot of new stuff.
Correct. So we're back to training again.
Yes.
Thank you, Lars. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions and answers. We have a few more minutes, 3-4 minutes, looking at our time. I cannot see any more hands raising. I have one question coming through text. That is about that interesting graph about the freight rates, Lars, which is always a question. And we saw that you are predicting the freight rate current trends to be declining, maybe towards the end of 2022. And that is to come and settle somewhere, in the region of 1,400 region, which is not as low as pre-COVID levels, but it is at a higher level. So 2 questions connected to that graph. First one is, how fast do you see that sharp drop can start happening? And how long will that stay in that region? Let's say, for example, in the region of 1,400.
How fast? I actually did an analysis on that a few months ago because I said, fine, what if rates go into free fall? Then we have to define how quickly can rates drop. And I actually looked at the data over the last 24 years. And the 2 periods where rates were dropping like a stone for a sustained period of time was during the financial crisis and during the price war the carriers had in 2015. So I said, fine, what if rates start to go down to free fall as bad as we saw back then? How quickly could we come back to normal? That is 18 months. So if rates start to go into free fall now, contracts will not come back to something that looks like normal until towards the end of 2023. Can rates drop faster than that? Unlikely, because if contract rates are to drop faster than that, we would either need to believe the global economy now goes into a recession much worse than the financial crisis, and right now there are no signs of that, or you need to believe the carriers would start a price war more vicious than we've ever seen before. But the carriers right now are also much more consolidated than ever before. So that also appears unlikely. And I just came back from the annual TPM conference in Long Beach, which is the largest container shipping conference, where typically the annual contracts for Trans-Pacific are negotiated. And that's where the data came out that annual contracts for 2022 are being settled at levels basically twice what they were in 2021. And increasingly, shippers are signing 2-year contracts, where levels for 2023 will only be marginally below where we were in 2022. So the currently extremely elevated levels, they are going to be with us this year and next. Of course, they're slowly going to taper off. And then beyond 2023, we come back to this new type of normality, where it's difficult to predict exactly when does it go up and down there, because that's down to the more normal fluctuations in a cyclical industry. But that's roughly the time frame.
Thank you, Lars. It's very clear. Looks like there are no more questions. Let me check. Yeah, there's one last question, Lars, in the chat box. The question is from Maldives. They're asking currently what is the approximate 2040 composition at US ports?
That is a good question. The honest answer is, off the top of my head, I don't know. So my answer would be the usual 80-20 rule, but that would be a pure guess on my part.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult one to guess anyway. Let's say, for example, if we take Sri Lanka, it's a 20 heavy market when it comes to imports, and we are 40 heavy on exports. So maybe. Yeah, I mean,
keep in mind, for the US market, it's driven by the imports, which is light cargo. A lot of the heavy cargo then tends to be put into the 40 footers, which are not then completely full.
Yeah, understood. Yeah. So with that, I think we have come to a close of today's interesting and exciting journey with you. I would once again like to thank Mr. Lars Jensen for joining and spending 1.5 of your time with us. We have people, I think almost 100 people join all the way from China, all the way up to Europe. So I hope you all learned something new out of this interesting webinar. And I also would like to thank once again, our sponsor, China SOC Lines, Mr. Daniel, who is joining with us today, and also our corporate sponsor, South Asia Gateway Terminals. So with that, we would like to close this webinar for today. We will try and connect with Lars once more, maybe close to the mid of the year, to bring in some more new topics. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for joining. And thank you so much, Lars, for your nice thoughts. And
well, then I would just say thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure being here. And also thank you to China SOC Lines for helping make it possible.
Thank you so much. Have a good day, everyone. All the best from ICS Sri Lanka.